think that that is a kind of two-way delivery of knowledge. It's a kind of dialogue that I'm really interested in because I think that that's really the only way to make universities both accountable, accessible, and also relevant in the 21st century.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff. With departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others, the college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Joining me today in the ASC Tech Studios is Cynthia Young, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. Trained as a literary critic and an interdisciplinary cultural historian, she specializes in 20th century radical social movements, U.S. civil rights history, 21st century forms of anti-Blackness, and African diasporic cultural production. Dr. Young, welcome to Voices.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, and you are the very new chair of the Department of African American and African Studies here. Welcome. Let me say that first of all. And I thought we'd start there. Give us a sense of your vision for AAAS at Ohio State.
Well, I think it's exciting to do this work in a moment where we're really trying to rethink universities for the 21st century. I mean, everything from thinking about AI and its impact on kind of writing and analysis and job creation and labor to just the kind of need to justify what universities do given exploding costs and given the kind of debt burden we're asking students to take on. And so I'm really trying to think about what a department like ours can do in a moment where it's important for undergraduates to have a sense of how complex the world is, right? Not just the U.S., to think deeply and critically about pressing social issues. So that's sort of one part. And I think it looks different now than it might have looked 10 or 15 years ago, as, you know, the world just keeps changing and as so many of our students here on the campus are of African immigrant origin, right? That's very different from the origins of Black studies in Black American struggle. So part of what I'm thinking through is that what kinds of courses can we produce that will help all sorts of students think about those questions. But then I'm also thinking about our graduate program and the ways in which we don't only want to be training very traditional scholars in the ways that, you know, we've trained them for the last 100 years or whatever, because that's not the world they're entering. I mean, the world I'm seeing around me is a world that badly needs the kind of critical thought and sense of history that Black Studies departments provide in all sorts of realms, right? In museums, in think tanks, in universities, in political mobilization groups, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm really trying to think about how we can equip our students and serve a different kind of niche maybe than most PhD and MA programs currently do. And I guess the last thing I would say is a vision is never the product of one person. And we recently had a kind of faculty retreat where everyone, with the exception of one person, was there. So it was very well attended. And we talked a lot about what does it mean to have a community extension center here? And how does that shape the research we do? How does it shape our relationships to communities outside of OSU? And so that's the other piece that a lot of us really want to think about from all sorts of perspectives, whether it's hip-hop pedagogy or it's public policy or it's humanities education. So that vision, I think, is coming together. It's not fully forged yet, but I do think that I would characterize it as very much community-oriented, very much kind of solution and critical thinking kind of driven in its approach.
Tell us a little more about the Community Extension Center. First of all, what it is, what it does, and what are some of the ideas you're thinking for what that center could look like going forward?
So the Community Extension Center has been a part of Ohio State for some years. It was recently renovated because the legislature gave it money to do so. It's located in a historically Black neighborhood, and it has had different functions over the years. So In some moments, it's been fairly dormant. In other moments, it's been a hub for all kinds of organizations to meet, for various kinds of meetings. So it's kind of been I guess you would say, almost a community center. I think it can do more than that. I think that's great. I think that universities should put their resources in service to all sorts of communities. But at the same time, I think there's a role for thinking about how we can be using the Community Extension Center as ways to think about new modes of delivering knowledge. We can be using it to think about new ways of collaborating with communities. We can use it as a place where particular faculty research can be anchored. So I think those are the ways in which I'm trying to think more expansively. It's an incredible space. It has a lot of what one would need to have big community gatherings, but it also has classroom space, et cetera. So I think in the next sort of 5 years, what we're going to be thinking about is how can we make it a space that is really driven by a research and pedagogical mission, as well as a kind of desire to make it available to the community.
You talked about new modes of delivering knowledge. Say a little more about what you mean by that.
Sure. I think that online learning has been with us for, quite some time now. And I think there are different modes for thinking about it. Mostly it's been, kind of asynchronous, meaning people are able to access it whenever they need to, whenever they want to, as long as they fit within certain parameters of time. And it's pretty much doing the same thing we've been doing in classrooms, but doing it online. I think that there is a great deal of opportunity for us to do different things around students engaging with us across time and space, around ways to make the kinds of histories, for example, that we're talking about more accessible to them by having guest lecturers who might be, in Cameroon, for example, by having projects that are digital projects and not just kind of here's the essay, I'm going to upload it, but digital projects that really do research in a way that is unique to the platform of digital learning. So I think that's one possibility. I also think that Black Studies has always assumed, maybe more than some departments, that we have a lot to learn from those who are not educated in traditional ways, right? That we have a lot to learn from folks who have felt, alienated from universities, for example. And I think that that's another thing we can be thinking about in terms of this center. So thinking about problems and how we can have conversations across lots of different kinds of experiences and divides and generations, et cetera. I think that is a kind of two-way delivery of knowledge. It's a kind of dialogue that I'm really interested in because I think that that's really the only way to make universities both accountable, accessible, and also relevant in the 21st century.
Two-way delivery of knowledge. I don't want to speak ill of anyone or any department. My sense is that we don't do that very well at this or maybe any other university.
I agree. I think that there are certain places where we assume it's happening more, perhaps. So, nursing, education, we sort of assume that because there's a kind of practicum element, there is that kind of two-way knowledge. So we have our students as student teachers, et cetera. But I'm not sure whether or not that is sufficient to really make it clear how much we have to learn from communities to make the theory really suit the practice.
It seems asymmetrical,
exactly.
The relationship.
Yeah, that is a better and more succinct way of putting it. And so, I really want to challenge, and this is what makes it exciting to be doing administration here, is that we have this Community Extension Center and we need to be able to do something with it other than just have it host parties and events. And so that's one thing. We already have it. And so we can be thinking about forms of knowledge dissemination and dialogue that really go beyond it. But I also think part of the reason that universities and departments aren't so good at it has to do with the ways in which we don't actually incentivize it, right? We don't incentivize people to do this work because if it doesn't have a product, right, a book, an article, whatever, then we've kind of in many places thrown up our hands and said, well, we don't know how to account for it, right? So impact, innovation, those kinds of things, I think, can be measured, thought through, but not necessarily quantified in the ways that people have been comfortable with in the past. And so I think what we've done is we've often asked scholars who want to do that kind of, community engagement, community mobilization, research that's really targeted and connected to a community, we've asked them to do both, right? We've said, you have to do the book, you have to do the kind of traditional stuff, you got to teach your classes, and then if you've got time and energy and space and whatever, do this other stuff. Or we've said, in the way that often law school students are told, make money, pay off those debts, and then you can go do something else. It's a kind of similar model. Get tenure, and then ... But what we all know happens is that you get formed and you make all sorts of commitments, and then it's much harder once you're sort of established to then shift gears really dramatically. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. We've not thought in innovative ways about how to incentivize, count, and think about tenure and promotion in ways that are much more expansive and I think creative, and really allow a university to be a space where so many different kinds of both research, knowledge production, teaching can flourish.
And you had talked earlier about rethinking the PhD. Do these ideas therefore influence your ideas about what a PhD can be?
Absolutely. So my training, I was an English BA at Columbia and then a PhD in American Studies at Yale. And I went from a very traditional read the literature, don't even think outside, don't do the theory, don't do the historical context, to a place that was very theory-driven, having been like a hub of deconstructionist thought.
Dear.
So, yeah, exactly. So I went from like one extreme to the other. But what was really new about being in American Studies is that it offered an opportunity to really pursue whatever interests. There were no rules in the way that I had felt there would be in other programs. And the fact that it was interdisciplinary from an early moment meant that it wasn't necessarily interdisciplinary in the way that we might imagine, because it was more kind of lit history. But it was pushing the boundaries of what disciplines could be. It was pushing the boundaries of what we can study, how we can think about things, et cetera. And so that was kind of my initial orientation as I started doing administration, right? You want excellent researchers, you want committed, passionate teachers, and then you want kind of interdisciplinary research that expands across the U.S. through the African diaspora. That was sort of my initial, and for a long time, that's kind of what I've pursued. Now, I guess what I'm thinking about is there are a lot more African American and African Studies PhDs today than there were when I went to graduate school. When I went to graduate school, Yale was just getting theirs up and running. So that's why I didn't do African American Studies. Now there's quite a few. There are also quite a few jobs in African American and African diasporic related topics. That said, there are a lot of really good programs out there that are private, that have a lot of money, that can really take their pick, right, in terms of the students they're getting. And it's a very, again, kind of traditional model. Like if you've got the GPA and the kind of credentials that I recognize, ... But actually what we know is that predictors of how people will do in graduate school really come down to whether people have faced adversity, whether people have the kind of resilience that allows them to keep picking themselves up, and also that they're bringing something different in terms of their perspective to their institution. And so I think we have a real opportunity to think about our graduate students in that way. Sure, we're going to get some great students who've come directly out of undergrad, but we might also get some folks who've been in the policy world or who have been teachers in K through 12 and now want to do something else. And so if we can think about how we would deliver our classes, a mix of online and in-person, grad classes, some of which may happen, after 4 p.m., those kinds of things, then I think we can draw a different set of students who want to think about kind of the broad applicability of what they're doing to their ambitions, but don't feel that we're saying you have to only go into the professoriate or it doesn't matter. I really want to seed AAAS students throughout all sorts of organizations, industries, institutions, because I think that that's really what it means to engage critically with the entirety of our society and not sort of one slice.
I'd like to talk about your research. You
Okay.
obviously think a lot about these issues as an administrator. Your research is also very interesting. I'd like to talk about a book you wrote back in 2006, Soul Power, Culture, Radicalism, and the Making of a U.S. Third World Left. And maybe just start with what were the main findings or the main argument made in this book.
Sure. So the main argument was that the way we thought about the civil rights movement at that point in the historiography of it was too narrow. It wasn't just kind of Black power, civil rights. There were also a group of people, and they were across a broad variety of, so some were writers, some were filmmakers, some were organizers, and some were unionists, labor, workers in hospitals. They were trying to think about how do you really bring together all the kind of fervor that was happening in the anti-colonial world at this moment, right? New independent nations trying to think through the colonial legacy and how to have Black liberation in a different context, and also coalition building, right, in the kind of mode of the anti-colonial moment where folks are collaborating, but also really challenging the structures that were felt to be very oppressive, in that particular moment. So I was really interested in who are these people who are trying to think about the relationship between the domestic and the international. What are they trying to think through in terms of fighting anti-Black racism, fighting labor exploitation, fighting sexism? And then how do they operationalize it? Like, what does it actually look like? And so I look at a few different groups. I look at Third World Newsreel, which is an independent filmmaking entity that starts in New York and really is built on more kind of old left or more anti-war filmmakers. They really take it in a different direction, but they borrow from that idea, that formation, community workshops. You just teach people, how do you do film? They're very much influenced by Cuban filmmakers at that moment who are like, we have a new country and a new revolutionary moment. We want to show life well beyond the kind of moneyed, European-styled classes. So they go out and just start making films about people. So they cover a squatters' rights movement. There are all this housing around Columbia University where their buildings were just abandoned. People didn't have places to live, so they just moved in and started building it and making it better. They ultimately were removed, but it wasn't necessarily about like success or failure. It was about what are people trying to do? How do they collaborate? How do they think more broadly than maybe it appears from the outside? I look at hospital workers, mostly Black and Puerto Rican, nurses aides, who collaborate with an older style, kind of CP-inspired pharmacist union. Communist Party-inspired Jewish pharmacists. They were unionized, but that was a small niche, right? The hospitals in the 50s and 60s are blossoming and hiring, and they're paying terrible wages. They're recruiting from communities where women are living in decrepit housing, et cetera. And so 1199, this hospital workers union that I write about, really tried to think about unionism as a space that could hold together different kinds of people with different, experiences, because you have Puerto Rican hospital workers and Black American hospital workers who've migrated from the South. But also, it's not just about wages, right? It's also about what is our relationship to this city that we're helping to sustain? Should we have safe housing? Should we have good housing? And then they also brought all these international anti-colonialists in to talk about how their struggle related to, the civil rights struggle. So the book is really a collection of stories about these different moments and these different modes of analysis and action that I wanted to highlight and spotlight. So as I was doing the project, I was really building an archive as I went.
Well, that was going to be my question. Were you consulting archives? Were you interviewing people?
Both. Yeah. So I wanted to, in the way that many students actually do, my advisor, who was Michael Denning, he's written many books. He's very well known in kind of American studies and like British cultural studies circles. He'd written this incredible book, The Cultural Front. And I was like, I'm going to write this book for the people I'm talking about. Right. And this is a very kind of familiar move. But what I found was that I had to figure out what the archive was. There wasn't like, okay, you just go to this archive at this place and you'll get it all. So I just started collecting and thinking about what was interesting to me. Like, what did I care about? So I went to Third World Newsreel's offices and I said, can I just look at the films you've got? And they just were incredibly generous. They just opened it up. They're like, look at all these films. So I was able to look at everything from the films on the anti-war movement, draft, riot stuff, all the way to the squatters' rights movement run by Puerto Rican women. And I just kept looking, kept digging, and kept thinking like, oh, what's interesting to me? Like, what's here that I really want to highlight? Same with 1199. I knew that I was interested in that union movement in that moment. I just went down to their offices, and they very generously were like, you can look at our newspaper from its creation. So it's just like decades of looking through their newspapers and just, oh, they're talking about this. They're also talking about that, sort of assembling it in that way. And then as I was reading, I kept seeing that there were certain themes that kept coming up, right? So the connection between oppression in the U.S. and colonial oppression, that was one theme. The idea that all of this kind of activism and organizing is intersectional. They're using a particular banner, right? So it might be unionism, it might be black, but they actually mean something that is much more complex. And that was actually one of the most interesting pieces to me, because when I was writing, there was a moment where new leftists, these people who were predominantly white and saw themselves focused on the war, the Vietnam War, and opposing it, they were disillusioned in the early 90s. And all of a sudden, they were sort of saying identity politics is just wrongheaded and it doesn't talk about class and it doesn't actually, it's not radical in a particular way. And I found that really interesting because the new left had rebelled against the old left that was talking about class as the central category. They were talking about culture, and they were talking about the ways in which all sorts of flowering could happen around, anti-war politics, but also black civil rights, voters' drives, hippie culture, et cetera. But then they were now looking back and saying, but not that, right? So they're wagging their finger in the way that the old left had wagged its finger at the new left. And so that was something that I kept kind of coming across, that people were talking about liberation and empowerment in ways that were very expansive. They weren't just talking about a very small niche. And I wanted to highlight the fact that even though we use sometimes simplistic language, especially if we're chanting or if we're, trying to make a political point in a particular moment. We actually mean something much more, often they meant something much more expansive and open-ended.
We were talking about alternative forms of scholarship a moment ago. And I know that you were, in 2014, you were involved in an exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, Witness, Art and Civil Rights in the 60s. First of all, tell us about your role. Tell us about the exhibition.
So the exhibition was an attempt to document the ways in which culture, and particularly photography as just one mode, was involved in shaping the civil rights struggle, involved in shaping the ways in which it was understood. I think we sort of maybe know that, but it's not often articulated. So, for example, the kinds of images that some of us remember or were there at the time to see, dogs attacking children or, fire hoses, et cetera. Those were often staged very carefully. And I don't mean they weren't real. What I mean is that there was thought behind, well, here's the kind of violence we're going to experience. Who do we want to be present that will then appeal to viewers who are watching it on TV, right? This is a moment every night people are watching on TV these different clashes with police, et cetera. And so that story, the ways in which there's a conscious way of making that kind of violence and that opposition to civil rights and black rights visible. We want people to actually see what it looks like. It's not theoretical, right? It's actually that people will beat you or they will train a hose on you or they will use attack dogs. And so part of it was just about that kind of photography and the ways in which it was capturing this moment. And it was also helpful in making the case to a broader public who had not experienced it themselves, who sort of vaguely thought, what's all the fuss about? But then they saw these images and they saw these pictures and it was like, oh, this can't go on. And so that's what the exhibit was trying to do. I just got asked, because of my work, I assume on Soul Power and Newsreel, to do an exhibition catalog essay, sort of framing it for the viewers and the people who would read the catalog. So it was an incredible opportunity. It came out of the blue, as many of these things do. It would be nice if we could just solicit these kinds of opportunities, but more often than not, people find out about us in various ways and then ask us to help out. So that's really how it happened, and it was incredible. I got to take my two small children to see it, and even though, they probably spent about 10 minutes looking at stuff, if that, it was really nice to sort of say, this is a different kind of intervention that your mama is trying to make than an article does.
Have you ever curated an exhibition?
I have not yet. I've wanted to, and I hope that it's in my future, but not yet.
If you could do that, if you could curate an exhibition, what would it be?
So my next project after the current book is going to be about Black diasporic culture And, so film, fashion, in the kind of moment from sort of 1970s through today is my thought right now. And I think it would be incredible to have an exhibition that could have, excerpts from films, that could have fashion, that could have different ways of thinking through the different articulations of identity, of mobilization that one might see in different forms, because it looks different. And so that would be an incredible thing to do.
I would love to see that happen. I usually ask some sort of question about, how do you end up in this research specialty? And I'm interested in that. But I think I'm be really interested to know, how did you end up as an administrator? I don't know if I've ever asked this of a guest before. How did you end up as an administrator?
So because I came out of graduate school at a moment of real kind of burgeoning interdisciplinarity, I was, even as an untenured professor, I was doing a lot of building of interdisciplinary programs. So I was an assistant professor at University of Southern California, and we were building a PhD in we called it then American Studies and Ethnicity. So that was everything from thinking about, like, what does the curriculum look like? Who are our students? All of that, all the stuff that I've been talking about in this context there. And at the same time, I was being asked to do all the same things that any other untenured person is asked. And so, I did get my book out. It was not out by the time I came up for tenure. And so I was denied tenure. And so I had to look around. But it was a curious thing in the sense that at that moment, it was a black box. So I had no idea. I put my stuff in the conveyor belt, and then I got the answer from the provost. So I didn't really have any idea what would happen. I thought I had the dossier to get it, but I also went on the job market, and I got 7 different flybacks. So I was doing a lot of work just around the country. And one of the opportunities I had applied to was as the director, I think that's what they called it, at Boston College, of their African American Studies department. And, they had very famous people who applied, and those 2 people turned them down, and then they got to me. And I think there were probably pretty modest expectations of what I could do as a newly tenured person coming in. And there was just so much runway and so much goodwill and faculty willing to help. And so I just started doing the work of putting all those questions about what the field does, where is it going, how is it training people, all of that. There was not a graduate program. There wasn't even a major. But I still could think about those questions and think about what are the kind of exciting trends, who might we want to hire, all that stuff. And that's when I realized I was spending so much time on it, and I realized, wow, there's something in this that you find profoundly gratifying, but also that is intellectual work. Mm-hmm. Because I do think that at base, I like thinking about things and I like solving problems. Like those are the 2 kind of core things that drew me to the work I do. And that's what administration is when it's done well. Mm-hmm. It's not just keeping the lights on. And I've never had that luxury. Or cutting budgets. And I've never had the luxury of walking into a department that was really, just raring to go and at the top of its game. When I come in, this is now the 3rd time I've done it, it's usually a department in transition or a department that has not been invested in for a while. And so I do have the opportunity to really kind of, remake the road as we're walking. And so that's really how it was, really happenstance. And just at the end of the day, I really, I was in a dual career academic couple, and I really liked the idea of being in Boston. There was an opportunity for a job, but I also, would have stayed in Southern California had I gotten tenure, because I loved flip-flops at Christmas. Like that was very appealing to me. So yeah, that's how I got into it. And then what I realized is that I could make it what I wanted to make it. I could make it something that was incredibly creative and collaborative, or I could make it something that was much more static, and I wasn't interested in the latter. And so I was able to make it the former.
Cynthia Young, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.